Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's my pleasure to follow the Right Honourable Lady, the member for Maidenhead, who has made a very careful and considered speech in response to these matters. It's good to know, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the days of establishment cover-ups in the immediate aftermath of tragedies such as we saw at Hillsborough and Bloody Sunday are over. And whilst I find much to disagree with the Right Honourable Lady, I know that she has been pivotal in making sure there was an inquiry in this case, and her actions were also pivotal in Hillsborough, and that's something about which we can agree. Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome the publication of Phase 1 of the report, but I agree with the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Leader of the Opposition, Leader of the Official Opposition, when he says that this was an avoidable tragedy. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Before I say anything else, I want, like others, to pay tribute to the resilience of the survivors of this tragedy and also the bereaved. Like many other honourable members, I had the privilege, thanks to Mr Speaker, of meeting with some of the survivors and the bereaved at a reception in the Speaker's offices, and that was of great use to me in understanding their lived experience of this avoidable tragedy, which must be central to how we deal with preventing that this sort of thing never happens again. As well as paying tribute to the fortitude and dignity of the families of the bereaved and the survivors, I also want, like others, to pay tribute to the bravery of individual firefighters, which for most of us is really unfathomable that they had the courage to run back and forth and in and out of that inferno. I believe also that the bereaved families have had very warm words for the coroner, Fiona Wilcox, and I think tribute should be paid to her as well as to Sir Martin Moorbeck and his staff. And of course, a tribute should be paid, as others have said, to the Honourable Lady, the member for Kensington, who had to deal with this terrible tragedy on her patch very shortly after she had been elected a Member of Parliament, but because she knew the area so well, has been able to do so, again with great fortitude and resilience. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's very important to remember this is only Phase 1 of the inquiry, and many have argued that perhaps this inquiry was the wrong way round and that Phase 1 should have looked at the cause of the fire and Phase 2 at the response. There's some force in that, but we are where we are. But I think it's very important to look to the statement that the Fire Brigades Union have made when they point out that before any firefighter arrived at the Grenfell Tower that night, it was already a death trap, and that the firefighters acted bravely in impossible circumstances, many of them repeatedly risking their own lives to save others, and indeed that is reflected in the report. But the Fire Brigade Union go on to say that the true culprits of the fire are those who wrapped the building in flammable cladding, and it's good that the inquiry has recognised that, and I'm sure Phase 2 will spend a lot more time looking at that. But also what contributed to this avoidable tragedy, Madam Deputy Speaker, was those who gutted the fire safety regime of the United Kingdom, who ignored the warnings from previous fires, and who didn't hear the pleas of a community who were worried for their safety. And I can't help thinking, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the story of the avoidable tragedy of Grenfell is a modern tale of two cities. Do we really think this carnage would have been allowed to happen if the residents of the tower were white, wealthy, middle and upper class residents such as we find elsewhere in Kensington? And do we really think the survivors and the bereaved would have waited so long for state support and rehousing if they had been white, wealthy and middle class? Of course not. And this divided city and our divided society has developed under the watch of the party opposite. As others have pointed out, the Prime Minister was Mayor of this great city of London at the time when cuts were made to the fire brigade. And there are issues of, there are issues of political responsibility which are properly the providence of this House. And I give way.
I'm very grateful to the right honourable lady for giving way. There's 2 points I made. There have been some, I'm not saying her, outside who said that the fire brigade differentiated their response because of the ethnicity of the people in the building, and that's complete and utter nonsense. I'm sure she would agree with that. But on her second point about the social class of the people in the building, a number of colleagues have referred to the privately owned freehold buildings across the country who are not getting recladded. They're all private blocks. They're all owned by leaseholders. The social blocks have all been done, perhaps a little slower, but they've all been done. These people are mostly white middle class, and they're in desperate need of their cladding being taken down and replaced.
Well, I can't disagree with the second point, and I also agree with the first point. But the point I sought to make was that it has not gone unnoticed by many of us that the social class and the ethnicity of the people in Grenfell Tower who died was very different from other people who live in the surrounding area. And there is a very strong suspicion that that has led to the way, and I'm going to make some progress, that has led to some of the shortcomings in this case. And as I said, Madam Deputy Speaker, when this House reassembles after general election 2019, we mustn't allow political blame for this avoidable tragedy to be deflected. And the second phase of this inquiry, I believe, will be uncomfortable for Conservative Party ministers and Conservative councillors who sat on their hands or took actions which let circumstances occur which have contributed to this tragedy. And I believe that phase 2 will be far more uncomfortable for them than part 1 has been for the fire service, and that's as it should be. Now, I welcome the undertaking from the Prime Minister to implement all recommendations for central government, but I reiterate the question that other honourable members have asked: will he commit to the requisite funding to implement those recommendations? Because in the past, Madam Deputy Speaker, there have been many post-death inquiries, many of which have made very important recommendations, but there isn't always the national oversight on those recommendations. There isn't a national body keeping track of whether they've been implemented. And the reality is that often important recommendations fall by the wayside. I will give way, yes.
Which is making. Would you think that as soon as the government's had a chance to consider, whichever government it is, the recommendation in detail, they publish a list of the recommendations, what they're going to do to implement them, how much that is going to cost, and the time frame when they will be delivered?
I may say so. I think that's an eminently sensible suggestion. Now, others have mentioned Lakenal House, and the honourable member for Easington pointed out that the tragedy at Grenfell wasn't the first time that compartmentalisation had failed. The Lakenal House fire, which resulted in the deaths of 6 people, with 15 residents and a firefighter injured, it was the subject of a coroner's inquest, and the coroner sent a Rule 43 letter to the then Community Secretary, as the honourable member for Easington has said, Eric Pickles, on the 28th of March 2013, and that letter recommended that the Westminster Government should, and I quote, publish consolidated national guidance in relation to the stay put principle and its interaction with the get out and stay out policy, including how such guidance is disseminated to residents. And I end the quote there. Ministers promised to review that guidance with the Local Government Association. However, in the 4 years after the coroner's letter, no guidance was produced. And so the lessons that should have been learned from the Lakenal House fire, and which might have prevented at least the scale of this avoidable tragedy, were not learned. And that's why it's very vital, Madam Deputy Speaker, that this House is empowered to make sure that the recommendations of Phase 2 are implemented promptly, because important recommendations have not been implemented promptly in the past. Now, I will give way, yes.
And does she accept that in relation to what should have taken place after the Lakenal House fire, that involves an examination, indeed, of the government of the day? And it's not to be partisan, but it's simply to say that it's important when we talk about justice, that it applies to everyone. The firemen are not here, but it's important that justice means that anyone, wherever they are, whichever party, because it may have gone back many years, are culpable and able to answer for the failure on behalf of those people.
I entirely agree, and that is the job of the inquiry, but also the job of this House to scrutinise, as I said earlier, the political responsibility for factors contributing to this tragedy. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, in Scotland, building regulations are devolved. And after a tower block fire in Irvine in 1999, just before devolution kicked in, a select committee of this House recommended that all cladding on high-rise dwellings should be non-combustible. And subsequent to devolution, that report was taken seriously by Scottish housing authorities, and building regulations in Scotland were duly amended in 2005. And all new high-rise domestic buildings in Scotland after that date were by regulation fitted with non-combustible cladding or a cladding system that met stringent fire tests, and with sprinklers. Now, the same recommendation was seen as optional south of the border, and it appears now that that has had tragic consequences. So it really is vital that this House finds a way to make sure that the inquiry's recommendations are properly implemented. Madam Deputy Speaker, it is also the case that a history of deregulation and its legacy has contributed to this tragedy. And that history dates back over many years and includes previous Conservative Party administrations' decisions to cut building regulations drastically, and the coalition government's cutting of fire budgets by around 28% in real terms. Now, these are facts, and the fact is that a regulatory regime for housing and fire safety has been created in England, which has contributed to the scale of this tragedy. And I believe also, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the coalition government's policy of austerity has contributed to conditions surrounding the scale of this tragedy. I'm conscious of not taking up too much time so others can speak, but others from the official opposition have already mentioned this afternoon cuts made by the Prime Minister to the London Fire Service when he was Mayor. And I have read very carefully comments from Matt Rack, the General Secretary of the Fire Brigades Union, who notes that a review of the Brigade's resources in 2016 warned against any further cuts to their budget and advised that City Hall be ready to mitigate any unacceptable negative impacts arising from cuts in the frontline resources made by the then Mayor, the Prime Minister. Now, these are allegations which come from somebody who knows what he is talking about. And I understand also that despite these concerns, the Prime Minister, when he was Mayor of London, went on to insist to Londoners that he'd improved fire cover, despite cutting the number of firefighters, fire engines and fire stations. And when confronted in the Greater London Assembly Chamber about this matter, he told a Labour Party Assembly member to get stuffed. I'm sorry for the language, Madam Deputy Speaker, but that is a fact, and I've seen the video. And I think it's a great indictment of our politics that that sort of approach to such serious matters is seen as acceptable by some. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think this tragedy outlines the fact, as Shelter, the charity, have said, that we need a national conversation about some of the broader policy issues, and particular social housing. In Scotland, even under the constraints of Tory and Lib Dem austerity, we've taken steps to build tens of thousands of new social homes. We've got rid of the right to buy, we've built council houses, and we've reintroduced security of tenure in the private sector. These are all things which are widely accepted in other European democracies, and we need to look at improving them in England and Wales. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, the families must never be forgotten in relation to this matter, and working with the I'm just coming to my end now. Working with the organisation Inquest, the families have produced a blueprint for the handling of future disasters, and they've called in particular for a coordinated response from central and local government and emergency services, and recommending a central point be set up for families to contact about missing relatives and for help and information. And I think these are the views of the families whose lived experience must be central to how we consider this avoidable tragedy, must be put at the heart of any work the next Parliament takes forward to put right the terrible wrong which occurred on that night.
Hear, hear, hear.